4 figures stood at the south fence, and the chain on the gate rattled once like a warning bell. Wind pushed dust along the rails and made the wire sing. Reed Harlan stepped out with his Winchester held low and safe, and saw 4 beautiful women pressed close as if the posts were their last solid thing. For 3 winters and 2 summers no one had crossed his boundary without his say-so, and now 4 faces lifted to him at once, and begged the same word with their eyes before their mouths found it. The tallest had a calm mouth and a blue dress faded at the seams. She said, "Please, one night on your side," and held up a folded paper with a county seal. The second wore riding trousers under her skirt and boots with the heels worn blunt. She kept a hand on the smallest of the 4, as if measuring her breath. The third had a black ribbon at her throat and a satchel tied with twine. The youngest looking of them had hair too clean for a long road and eyes that understood dust anyway. Reed set the rifle muzzle to the porch rail and walked down slow. He lifted the top wire with his palm until the barb stung and hooked the chain. He said, "Step through careful. No one rips silk on my wire and calls it my fault." Names came like water poured fast. Retta Lane, Seraphine Glass, Nora Keene, Isabella Cruz. Retta held the paper steady while the others slid past, and Reed broke his own old rule in the same breath. "No one crosses this fence," he said to make the words real so he could feel them change. "Unless they need a door more than I need a wall." He swung the gate wide, and the chain clinked like a coin thrown down on a table. They drank from a tin dipper on the pumpstone, and it shook in Retta's hand and made light chatter on the rim. Dust plumed on the road like someone was dragging a dry curtain. 6 riders came into view behind a canvas-topped wagon with the letters RMR Freight cut into the sideboards. The lead horse threw a shadow over the outer rail, and a narrow man in a grey coat sat with both reins in one hand like the other. Hand had better things to do, Lathrop, company assessor. He said his own name and office in one tone like a brand across a hot iron. He pointed his chin at the 4 women and let a smile crack, where respect should have lived. "Det walked off from our weighhouse last night," he said. "Return our girls and the account and we call it even." The word girls snapped like an insult against teeth, and Reed felt his jaw find the old place. It sat when a man talked wrong on his side of a fence. Retta lifted the paper higher with a line in her wrist that kept it from shaking. "Appointment to Mesa School by county vote," she said, stamped and signed. Lathrop did not look at seals, he looked at faces and saw only money. His horse's chest brushed Reed's wire and made it groan. He said, "You live out here alone long enough, you forget who owns daylight." Reed kept gentle because gentle holds longer. "This fence remembers," he said. "It remembers who helped set it and who cut it. You push that horse until a barb kisses hide, and I will make the post remember you too." He touched the Winchester only enough to make meaning. Lathrop smiled in a way that set every tooth against another tooth. "Your note at the bank says 280 by harvest," he said, like he enjoyed the number. "Do not stake your acres on 4 pretty mouths and a stamp." He thought of the note the way a man thinks about a winter that will come whether he likes it or not. He thought of the years he had not let a soul step inside without a reason. He could shout on a courthouse eve, he said out loud so the whole yard would hear it and hold him to it, "I will not sell a night to the company when the county already bought it." He turned the gate chain once around his hand and hooked it back with a click that sounded like a vow. "You and your men keep your muzzles down, I keep mine down, and we talk until the hour gives up." Seraphine pressed the younger woman closer to the shade of the porch post, as if his words had made a room. Lathrop's second man let his carbine slide up until the barrel passed the line of the wire and the iron flash in the sun. Put a hard taste in Reed's mouth. He fired a warning into the dust between the front 2 hooves. Gravel jumped like fleas and the animal danced and settled. No blood, only knowledge. The assessor's men jerked and then forced their guns toward earth when Lathrop cut a palm in the air, because he had the kind of sense that keeps a face pretty in front of a crowd. Nora hissed between her teeth to bleed fear somewhere other than her eyes, and then bit down on the sound and made it into grit. In the kitchen they laid sweat on wood and paper on table. Retta opened the county dispatch and showed the seal again like it could be a hearth if you held it close enough. "We were hired to open a school at Mesa and lodge fare until the doors," she said. "The company weighhouse tried to levy a boarding charge for the road and then doubled it, and then told us there was a gentleman who would pay for a night if we sat quiet in his private parlor. Seraphine said, He had a wedding ring in his pocket and a wife alive across the river. Nora worked the twine off her satchel and revealed 3 readers and a bell that looked like it had called better mornings than this. Isabella lifted a heel and showed a crack in the leather, and did not complain. Reed let himself say what he always kept back. I once set survey stakes for Lathrop's outfit when I did not know better. He paused when the confession put a crack in him and felt fresh air in it. The map I drew cut 3 small ranches in half and 1 spring out of a widow's kitchen. I fixed the map on my own time and they fixed my name off their books. Retta listened in the way a river listens to its banks. She said, "Then you know the cost of a line drawn wrong. We are asking to sleep inside a line drawn right." Isabella put her fingertips on the table edge as if measuring its square. She said, "I can sew a torn shirt for the price of the thread if you need payment," Nora said. "I can tally interest until your banker's numbers blush," Seraphine said. "I can shoe a horse without lame hands." Reed felt the kitchen go from strangers to work in one breath, and that is a valuable change. By sundown, the sheriff came with 2 deputies and a preacher who had dust on his collar like a badge. Hale looked tired in the wise way and not tired in the weak way. He took Lathrop's paper and read the rescission of the appointment, and then took Retta's dispatch and read the judge's interim order, and held both like 2 sides of a plank. "A man cannot stand on both at once," he said out of the corner of his mouth like advice. Lathrop rolled confidence between his fingers like a coin, and said, "You will not keep your badge if you shame the rail and freight." The preacher coughed and said, "Ladies do not lodge at a bachelor ranch," Seraphine said. "Ladies do not ask men like you to measure them." Hale handed the preacher his cough back and spoke to Reed. "If I escort them to the schoolhouse in the morning, I will have to write a report, and the report will not be the story the company wants. You will have men unfriendly to your horizon." Reed nodded because he had lived most of his life with his back to a horizon that did not like him. "The note at the bank is not my worst enemy," he said. "The worst is waking up and hating the man in my mirror." Lathrop decided humiliation with a smile would serve him. He looked the 4 women up and down like a column of numbers and said, "Curtsy if you want mercy." Nora looked him in the face in a way that would have told a better man to go home and burned the day's joke out of the air. Reed walked to the gate and took down a rough cedar slat he kept wired on the inner post as a spare rail. He set it across the top 2 wires and pinned it there with 2 nails and a twist of baling wire until it lay like a narrow bridge. He fished 1 nail from his pocket and drove it up through the end of the slat to make a little iron point. He said, "Here is my rule. Anyone who steps across puts an open hand on this plank and says, 'I cross to keep women safe.'" Hale raised 1 eyebrow and then let it fall. Lathrop laughed the way a man laughs at a church bell in a storm. "You think a fence trick fixes law?" Reed said. "I think things men touch with the palm and the tongue fix men." The crowd that had grown along the road listened because men like to hear a clean thing when the day is dirty. The first watch ran long and thin. Lathrop sent 2 riders in the dark to lift the latch. While most men had gone home to pretend their dinner had nothing to do with his yard, Seraphine saw the shadow move at the gate and tapped Reed's shoulder with the back of her fingers. He walked out with his hat in his hand as if to offer a guest shade and fired into the dry strip by their toes. Little pebbles nicked a stirrup and sang against iron, and the men shook like dogs and ran. The nails in the slat sang a quiet, expensive music while the wind leaned. Retta sat on the porch step with the bell in her lap, like a small heart waiting to decide when to beat, and looked at the fence as if it were a blackboard she expected to write on by dawn. Morning through light so sharp you could use it like a knife. The fence cut 2 kinds of sky, the one that belonged to Reed and the one that wanted him to forget. 12 men stood along the road with Lathrop and 3 with the sheriff, and 3 who had come to see if a line could be taught to stand on 2 legs. The banker Ellis rode up late and tied his bay and carried no expression but the 1 numbers leave on a face after a night. Reed's Winchester rested on the porch rail with its muzzle pointed into dirt, like a prayer anyone could say. Hale put his hand on the cedar slat and felt the little nail and jerked just enough to understand the point. He said, "If there is to be a crossing, let women cross first with my hand on the board." Lathrop spat a brown line and watched it dry in mid-fall. He hauled a new paper that claimed lodging due at $30 a head and signed it with his private flourish as if a curl of ink could become a sheriff. Nora stepped to the wire with her ledger and spoke numbers, so clear the dust straightened. She said, "Weighhouse rate is 50 cents. I can point to a column that does not lie. Yours looks like a man's fear when a woman holds a quill," Hale decided, and then behaved. He said, "I will ride with them to Mesa. I will bring them under my office, and any man lays a hand in anger will find his writs burned on a cookstove in front of him." Lathrop started forward, and the toe of his boot met the cedar slat, and his hand did not come up, because he did not intend to say the words. The board held him long enough for an idea to catch. Reed said, plain as feed, "You cross this at the level of your palm and your voice, or you do not cross." Lathrop backed, and the smile fell off like a cheap button off a hard shirt. They left at 8. Retta rode by Hale, and the bell rested in her saddlebag, with its tongue tied so it would not ring in the wrong minute. Seraphine rode with her shoulders square and her eyes on the brush. Nora counted fence posts like counting pennies. Isabella held the satchel under her arm with the ache of a seamstress who means to hold until it stops being work and starts being promise. Reed walked beside the road and kept the Winchester down and ready to speak only in dust. At the bend by the wash, a freight team rolled in from a cut and tried to hem their horses against the arroyo bank. Hale put his gelding left, and Reed put his rifle up and to the earth and cracked a shot into clay. Wet mud spat like an insult and spattered a rider's boot. Nobody bled, everybody learned. They reached the little building with a slate nailed over the door and a pile of chalk like bones in a basket. 3 mothers stood there in mourning dresses that had seen better mornings, and a boardwoman who had liked the company the last time she had counted its coins. Retta lifted the dispatch like a lantern, and the boardwoman put her finger under the circle of the seal and sighed the sigh of a person who is tired of being watched by her own children. She signed a temporary acceptance, while her mouth stayed neutral and her eyes said thank you to no one she could name. The bell rang once for the sound of it, and one small boy cried because something had finally rung in a town that had learned to be quiet around money. If you were standing where he stands now, with every ridge of your life covered by a man who can make or break you, would you open the gate anyway? And if this kind of frontier choice grips you, subscribe and stay with us on the trail, because these hard roads run long and true. On the way back, Lathrop waited at the creek with a fresh jaw and a thinner smile, and 2 new men whose mouths were wrong at the corners. The cedar slat lay across Reed's gate like a narrow law, and the chain freckled with dust from hands that had tested it and learned. Hale raised his palm and asked low, "You ready to make this the picture they talk about in the saloon until it turns into a story?" Reed nodded once. Retta took the bell and set it on the slat. It shone like a bright small coin in a mean market. She said, "We cross by this bridge and we leave by it. No one puts a man's hand on our reins without saying the words." The sound of her voice reached the men by their throats and not their ears, and they did not like learning from that part of themselves. Lathrop tried cheap law again because cheap law is a habit. He waved a deputy from the next county who had a loose badge and a tight belt. The man mumbled about disorder and public morals and other things that never find a bed when they go home at night. Hale said, "This is my county. That badge is not worth the pin that holds it on." Then he touched his palm to the slat and spoke the sentence, "I cross to keep women safe." He stepped up, the deputies followed. Reed gunned a warning into the air for Lathrop's benefit alone, so he would have a sound to remember later when he retold this day to a man who was not tired of him yet. The last hard moment came when Lathrop reached too quick and snagged Isabella's satchel strap, and the leather screamed. Reed had his hand on the slat and his other on the rifle, and he did not lift the barrel above the line he had promised. He drove another shot to the dirt so close to Lathrop's boot that dust placed a white necklace on the black of his polish. The assessor froze, and practice fell out of him. Hale swung his horse to push the space wider, and the preacher did a living thing and used his body for once. He stepped between money and bad behavior, and the world did not end. Lathrop let go because nothing was going to the Weighhouse the easy way, and he had no taste for the hard way, when eyes were eating him like corn. By dusk, the 4 women lay blankets on Reed's bunkhouse floor and made it look like a plan had been waiting there for a long time and just needed feet. Nora tallied the day against the banknote and frowned, and then squared the corners of her frown with resolve. Seraphine found the loose hinge on the pantry door and set it true with 3 nails and a hammer face polished by wheat jobs. Isabella stitched a torn sleeve of Reed's Sunday shirt and did not charge even a smile. Retta sat with a knife and carved the day into the cedar slat. She notched 4 marks for 4 crossings and a line for the others who had stood and kept their hands honest. She wrote a word under the notches with the knife tip, and it took her a minute because she wanted it right. Keep. The second night brought 3 men with a coil of wire and an idea about dragging the fence down quiet. Seraphine heard the wire speak a high note. She touched Reed's shoulder again, and this time he handed her the Winchester, and she raised it and put a warning into the dark seam above the ditch, and the bullet lifted dust where coyotes cross. The men folded and left without learning anything new. The fence hummed, and the bell answered with a little chime, like they were 2 voices that had finally learned harmony. In the morning, Retta asked for a nail and a piece of chalk and a strip of blue cloth. She tied the cloth around the slat where her knife had written keep, and chalked the names in a neat hand, Lane Glass Keen Cruise. Then she added one more word in small letters. A school would understand guest, she said. This stays until your banker stops asking why and starts asking how. Ellis, from the bank, walked up the path right then, with his hat in his hands, the way a man holds it when numbers have taught him humility. He said, I can move the due date by 30 days, and I can look away from interest if I see that slat every time I come from town. Reed looked at the blue cloth and at the carved marks, and at the line in the dirt the board had made. He said, you will see it. And Ellis nodded like a man who had been permitted to join an honest club. 3 weeks later, the school rang its bell every day, until the sound began to live in people and not just in air. Lathrop filed papers in a bigger town and found out the judge there liked circles drawn by women when men tried to make straight lines through them. Hale kept his badge and did not sleep worse for it. The preacher learned to leave his collar alone when he stood in a yard like this. Reed paid down $50 on the note with fence work for a neighbor who had stopped waving in the road and started again. He and Retta stood at the fence at sundown one evening when the light turned the wire into 3 horizontal fires and the dust into a veil. She said, your rule made a man of you today. He said your knife made a law of wood. A hawk wrote its letter across the sky and the bell clicked in the breeze, and the slat held the words against the weather. He wanted to reach for her hand, and he did not. He took the knife instead, and added a small notch for the day they had not been hurt and had not hurt anyone and still won. She watched him. And that was something too, when the board tried to move the school closer to town, because Lathrop promised lumber at a discount if they played nice. Retta brought the slat to the meeting and laid it across 2 chairs and said, we will hang this above the door, and whoever walks under it without the sentence on their tongue will feel the wrongness in their teeth. The board president smiled with her eyes and signed her name under the chalk marks. News of the slat traveled like a good rumor, and a man with a bad plan found he could not walk under keep without getting a cough. The 4 women did not become his. They became themselves under his roof for a while, and that is a finer prize. Seraphine taught the blacksmith's daughter to hold a rasp with calm hands. Nora made the storekeeper's son redo his sums without shame but without mercy. Isabella filled a trunk with mended shirts for men who did not know what to do with a needle, except bleed on it. Retta wrote letters for wives who could not risk their husbands reading about pride that had survived a season of fear. Reed fixed fence and learned that a boundary can be a promise and not just a dare. When the first snow traced the strands of wire in white and made the fence look like a line written by winter itself, Retta stood by the gate and said, we move into town now. A school needs to be where a child can walk to it without looking back at the same post 10 times. He said, you take the slat. She said, no, it belongs to this threshold. We will make another with new notches. She lifted the bell and set it back on the board, as if tucking a child into a bed that had been earned. Seraphine hugged him with a back slap like a brother, because that is how some loves live clean. Nora pressed a folded sheet into his hand with 4 new columns for 4 new months and a different date for the harvest note. Isabella tied a blue thread around his wrist. She said, "For when you forget to keep your hand open." They rode off under a sky that looked like a field turned upside down, and something in his chest did not close after them. He left the gate open a span, and then closed it. Because a fence is a promise in 2 directions. The blue strip on the slat fluttered, and he imagined men he did not like reading it slowly with their lips and learning against their will. By spring, the county road crew came and asked if they could cut across his south pasture to shave a mile off a wagon path, and he said yes if their hands fit on the board and their mouths made the sentence. Every man did, and one laughed, and then grew still when the words stood inside him like a post. In the quiet that followed, he understood the weight and the shape of what had been done. A lonely fence had been turned into a narrow bridge, and he had been turned into the one who kept it true. Beauty had come to his yard, not as a debt, but as a measure. Mercy had opened the gate, and courage had kept it open long enough for law to catch up. Honor had meant counting the cost in coin and in sleep and paying anyway. If this kind of Western choice sits right with your heart, ride with us again and subscribe. Toss a coin in the hat if you want to keep the bell ringing and the boards carved. There are more fences that need doors, and more doors that need someone to stand in them until the right people pass through. And if your heart still isn't done riding tonight, tap the next story waiting on your screen, or open the Frontier playlist and stay in the saddle with us a little longer. There is another hard Western tale right there that will hit just as deep and keep you listening until the very last word falls.